Okay. Dr. James Anno is Associate Curator of European Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. He took up his appointment in Houston in 2019, and his projects there have included the recent exhibition, Glory of Spain, Treasures from the Hispanic Society, Museum and Library. He earned his PhD at Washington University in St. Louis, where he wrote a dissertation on Michelangelo, exploring the intersection of movement and time. From 2017 to 2019, he was the inaugural American Friends of Capodimonte postdoctoral curatorial fellow at Capodimonte, where I first had the pleasure of meeting him. His publications include essays on Francesco Guarino and Artemisia Gentileschi, and he co-authored with Christopher Bacchi the catalog Flesh and Blood, Italian Masterpieces from the Capodimonte Museum, which accompanied the marvelous exhibition presented in Seattle and Fort Worth last year. For many of us, it was one of the last times that we gathered with artworks together before the onset of COVID. That will happen again soon, I'm confident. James's talk today focuses on one of the great pictures held in Houston at the Museum of Fine Arts. His title is Circa 1656, Partenope, Plague, and Mattia Preti's Martyrdom of St. Paul. Thank you, James, for being here.
Thank you, Sarah, again for your invitation. It's always nice to be with you, especially from our days in Naples. Thank you, Francesca, for working out the logistics for this seminar. And thank you to everyone else for joining today. Let's begin. My first memorable encounter with Mattia Preti's The Martyrdom of St. Paul occurred in 2019 in Naples on the occasion of an exhibition staged at the Palazzo Zavalos entitled Rubens, Van Dyck, Ribera, The Collection of a Prince. At the time, I was serving as the American Friends of Capodimonte postdoctoral curatorial fellow at the Capodimonte Museum, which occasioned the daily opportunity to make the long walk home from the Reggia, perched atop the city, to my neighborhood of Chiaia on the bay. Via Toledo often served as my Virgil, guiding me through the bustling corridors of this most ancient city. This well-appointed avenue of Via Toledo boasts the Palazzo Zavalos, a present-day bank and museum where orchestral performances are often performed in its cortile, beckoning passers-by to enter like Partenope's song to Odysseus. Unlike the great hero, I heeded the call on an unassuming spring day and entered, whereupon I came into the presence of the Martyrdom of St. Paul, whose monumental immediacy and heroic psychological presence continues to leave an indelible mark on the landscape of my imagination. Little could I have known that only a few short months later, I would become its keeper in the permanent collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Self-indulgent as my prologue may be, it is nonetheless emboldened by an essay digested long ago, penned by Leo Steinberg in 1967, entitled Objectivity and the Shrinking Self. In this essay, Steinberg decried the decoupling of an art historian's encounter with a work of art with the means by which he proceeds to write about it. Our first impressions, the reverberation of sensory experience and memory, can often form an indissoluble whole where subject and object somehow commune in the union of encounter. Honored by the invitation to contribute to the present seminar series and bolstered by Steinberg's admonition, I have elected to proceed by selecting Preti's masterpiece as the focal point of our discussion today. In no small way, my personal objective, selfish as it may be, is a curator seeking to better understand a work in his collection. The more noble aim of this lecture is to explore the artistic, social, and mercantile context in the city of Partenope in circa 1656, which provided the necessary conditions for Preti to produce his masterpiece, The Martyrdom of St. Paul. As we will discover, the patron of this commission, the Fleming Ferdinand van den Eyden, came to own the Palazzo Zavalos by inheritance through his father, Jan, who had purchased the palazzo between 1659 to 1661. Already considered the greatest painter in Rome upon his arrival to the capital city of the Viceregno in 1653, the death of Giuseppe de Ribera only the year before in 1652 cleared the way for Preti to assume the mantle as the city's most esteemed and sought after artist until his permanent departure to Malta in 1660. And all of this transpired during a period that presented one of the greatest tragedies and challenges the city has ever faced, namely the devastating and notorious plague of 1656. How might this event have affected Ferdinand van den Eyden's commission and Preti's execution of it? Questions abound, but first we must begin at the beginning. As Mattia Preti is a well-known but perhaps not household name in the wider world of art history, it seems in order to outline the broad strokes of his artistic biography leading up to the master's arrival to Naples in 1653. Preti was born in the Calabrian town of Taverna in 1613 to parents Cesare Preti and Innocenza Schipani. Both Mattia and his older brother by 10 years, Gregorio, received excellent training in the classics in their hometown. Yet Taverna had little in the way of artistic offerings for two young aspiring artists. As a custom already well more than a century old, Gregorio and Mattia first made their way to Rome in the early 1630s, although Mattia is not firmly documented in the Eternal City until 1636, when the brothers rented an apartment in the parish of Biagio a Montecitorio. A cleavage of artistic sensibility emerged quite early as Gregorio pursued the classicizing example of Domenichino, while Mattia embarked on his stylistic pilgrimage to adopt and absorb the naturalism and chiaroscuro of Caravaggio, which by that time had to some degree already fallen out of fashion in Rome. Mattia was, and nevertheless, the far greater painter. Mattia garnered many commissions during his Roman period in the 1630s to the early 1640s, the zenith of which is perhaps his St. Catherine of Alexandria, visited in prison by the Empress Faustina. Likely executed in 1641-42 for Don Taddeo Barberini, prefect of Rome, this forceful painting was presumably conceived as an altarpiece, although it went directly to his patron's noble gallery. In this work, we already see a mature Mattia. The composition is monumental in conception, with very fine modeling of the figures that are accentuated by the divine light that streams down from above. In addition to Caravaggio, one might also sense notes of Guercino. Importantly, it was in November of 1641 that Preti submitted his request to Pope Urban VIII Barberini for admittance as a Knight of Grace into the Order of St. John, which he received in October of 1642. Henceforth, Preti was often referred to as Il Cavaliere Calabrese, or the Calabrian Knight. Upon the death of Pope Urban VIII and the resulting fall of the Barberini in 1644, Mattia departed Rome for Venice, where he remained through 1645, attending to close study of the Venetian masters, especially Titian and Veronese. Veronese in particular left an indelible mark on Preti, the fertile result which we see in his monumental biblical scenes set within lofty architectural spaces, situated within the cityscapes of the imagined ancient past. After his sojourn to Venice, the artist then returned to Rome in 1646, where he remained until 1651. And we'll go ahead and circle back to this image here momentarily. The most notable work from Preti's last Roman period, and to that point, the most prominent commission of his career, are the three complementary, large format frescoes for the altar of Sant'Andrea della Valle in Rome, depicting episodes from the Martyrdom of St. Andrew. Preti received this commission from Cardinal Francesco Preti Montalto in January 1650. The works were unveiled in April of 1651 with Molto Applauso Universale, according to one chronicler. Yet we have reason to believe from Bernardo de Dominici that the works may not have been received well, and we should take that with a grain of salt. Here, Preti seems to make an attempt to synthesize his Caravagesque approach with the more decorative impulse of Pietro da Cortona. Regardless of reception, the commission itself is an emphatic confirmation of the painter's elevated status in Roman painting. Departing Rome for Modena from 1651 to 52, Preti then returned briefly to Rome until his fateful decision to try his hand in Naples, the capital city of the Spanish Vicerregno. We know that by March 1653, thanks to Jim Clifton, Mattia had opened an account in Naples at the Banco della Pietà, whereupon he immediately set to work. His earliest documented work that we know of is the striking Saint Nicholas of Bari of 1653, commissioned by Isabella Gallo for the Calabrian National Church in Naples, San Domenico Soriano. Preti's powerful opening salve into the Neapolitan art scene bespeaks his awareness and burgeoning absorption of the immense legacy established by Giuseppe de Ribera over the last 30 years, culminating in Lo Spagnoletto's death, as Ribera was called, in 1652. Ribera had made a specialty of monumental, closely cropped martyrdoms and portraits of saints that express a naturalism and brutality particular to the Neapolitan scene, as exemplified in Ribera's Martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew, dating to 1644. With Preti's Saint Nicholas of Bari, we already see that he has accepted the challenge of Ribera's legacy, successfully stepping into the lacuna in the city's artistic scene precipitated by Ribera's death. The year 1653 was also fortuitous for Preti, as he entered the circle of the greatest merchant collector of the era in Naples, Gaspar Rumor. Rumor commissioned Preti, likely in 1653, to paint The Feast of Herod, a work inspired by an earlier work in Rumor's collection of the same subject, executed by Peter Paul Rubens between 1635 to 38, and acquired by Rumor probably in 1640. Preti's entrance into Rumor's orbit makes a critical step in our march towards Preti's Martyrdom of St. Paul, as it brought the painter closer to its eventual patron, Ferdinand van den Eyden. We have reached the moment in our discussion where it will prove beneficial to pivot towards exploring a précis of the collecting scene in Naples during the early 1650s, as viewed through the lens of Gaspar Rumor and the van den Eyden family. As a bustling port city, Rumor and the van den Eydens were able to establish themselves amongst Naples' elite merchant collectors, who between the two of them comprised the city's greatest private patrons and collectors of art. The mercantile economy of Partenope provides the fertile ground that Preti was able to establish his roots and garner commissions, especially for our purposes, the Martyrdom of St. Paul. Gaspar Rumor was born in Antwerp near the end of the 16th century. Rumor was a ship owner and trader, merchant, and banker who in the course of his illustrious career amassed a fortune valued at the astounding sum of some 4 million ducats. Rumor was likely already operating out of Naples by the 1620s, entering into the full force of his powers and influence in the 1630s. Rumor was also a voracious patron and collector of art. By his death in 1674, according to the inventories, he had established a vast collection of roughly 1,500 paintings. Although a man of international artistic tastes, importantly, Rumor promoted the local Neapolitan school that had developed in the wake of Caravaggio's 2 sojourns to the city in 1606-07 and 1609-10, including many works by Ribera, Battistello Caracciolo, and Massimo Stanzione, only to name a few. At his death, Gaspar Rumor was widely considered the greatest collector of art in Naples. The van den Eyden family was business partners with Rumor. The patriarch of the van den Eyden family was Romuald van den Eyden, a merchant from Antwerp who died in late 1615. Romuald had two sons, Ferdinand the Elder and Jan. Both Ferdinand the Elder and Jan are documented in Naples by 1611 to 1612. Upon the death of their father Romuald, Ferdinand the Elder returned to Antwerp to attend to family business, as Jan remained in Naples. The Van den Eydens were one of the greatest collecting and artistic families of Antwerp, with marriage ties to Bruegel the Elder, Gertrude de Jode, and Jan de Weil. It is Jan van den Eyden and his son Ferdinand the Younger who would make the greatest mark on the city's artistic scene within the family. Jan had entered into business with Römer by 1615, during a period where the exportation of goods and movement of capital were particularly advantageous, given a devaluation of the local currency that did not equilibrate until about 1621. Römer and Jan made out like bandits, as they say. Jan inherited his brother Ferdinand's wealth at his death in 1630, further bolstering Jan's position. Dealing in Sicilian silks, Egyptian carpets, sugar, diamonds, and English goods, for example, more than an estimated 6.5 million ducats worth of business was conducted between Römer and Jan's partnership during the years of 1641 to 45. Prior to that, in the mid-1630s, the partners issued a loan of 40,000 ducats to the Spanish crown. Thus, Römer and the Van den Eydens also functioned as financiers and bankers. While the slums of Naples were an ever-present fixture, business boomed nonetheless in the city during this period in a manner near unrivaled on the Italian peninsula. The Van den Eydens had significant success in climbing the social ladder as well. Jan's son Ferdinand the Younger bore the fruits of his father's labors. Ferdinand, no doubt made possible by his family's deep pockets, purchased the novel title of Marquis of Castelnuovo in 1660. Now there was a Marchese in the family. Ferdinand married well also, taking Olympia Piccolomini as his bride. Their daughter Giovanna married Giuliano Colonna, whose son inherited the prestigious family name of Colonna. Within only 3 short generations, the Van den Eydens had successfully ensconced themselves within the Neapolitan upper crust. We can see the Van den Eyden success manifests itself physically in the city by the properties they successively purchased. First, Jan took an apartment in 1623 on the prestigious Via Toledo, indicated by the number 1 on our 1629 map of Naples. Second, the Palazzo of the Albizia di Cava, and third, the position of the Palazzo Zavalos that would be purchased by Jan between 1659 to 1661. And you can look at the map to our lower left, you can see the Palazzo Reale. To the right of that with the towers, the Castel Nuovo, above it in the open space, present day Piazza Municipio, and then Via Toledo, which runs through numbers 1, 2, and 3. Anyone who's been to Naples will recognize this scene. The Römer Van den Eyden relations do not terminate with business, but also spill over into art and collecting. Römer was a progressive collector, and Ferdinand van den Eyden seems to have followed his lead in terms of taste and artists. In 1655, Römer commissioned Preti to execute The Wedding at Cana, which distinctly draws upon the lessons the painter learned while studying the great master Veronese during his sojourn to Venice in the mid-1640s. Christ, who is to our right in a blue mantle and halo, is in the process of turning water into wine as his divine digit directs the miracle towards the wine vessels below. Perhaps impressed by this work executed for his good friend Gaspar Römer, Ferdinand took the leap to commission Preti to paint a series of 3 martyrdoms in 1655 or 56 for his own collection. Thus enter the martyrdom of St. Paul. As John Spike notes, prior to Ferdinand's commission, the martyrdoms of saints did not occupy a prominent position in Preti's corpus. The trilogy of the Crucifixion of St. Peter, the Martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, and the Martyrdom of St. Paul thus mark a novel step in Preti's thematic repertoire. The St. Bartholomew and St. Paul canvases are perhaps the most forceful, as the artist isolates the suffering saints with monumental grandeur. John Spike suggests that Houston's St. Paul canvas may have been the last work completed in the trilogy, given the more sophisticated play of light across the figures, at least according to his eye. The implication then would be that it's likely the Martyrdom of St. Paul would have been painted in 1656, the same year as the onset of the plague. We may want to reiterate that more than any other artist, it is Ribera who Mattia took inspiration from on the theme of martyrdom, although both artists expressed their visions in distinct manners. The grit and brutal realism of Ribera has its counterpoint in Preti's vision of martyrdom as a crown of glory. Ribera's figures groan and writhe. Mattia's example, Baroque as it is, presents a more poetic sensibility. Rather than pain, Preti's St. Paul manifests noble fortitude. So now let's turn to the image itself of the martyrdom of St. Paul. The Apostle Paul was martyred in 64 AD in Rome during the persecution of the Emperor Nero. And I'll just note that that date is contested in the historical literature. We place Paul's martyrdom between 64 and 67 AD, but I'm going to go ahead and stick with the traditional dating of 64 AD. It was in the same year that a notorious fire broke out in Rome, raging throughout the city for 6 days, whereby Nero accused the Christians of instigating the blaze. As the Roman historian Tacitus recalls in his Annals, quote, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty of being Christians. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much for the crime of firing the city, as of hatred for mankind. And this is because Christians didn't take part in the civic life of the Roman Empire. Paul, no doubt, refusing to take part in Rome's social and civic life, the cornerstone of which was making offerings to the emperor and pagan gods, likely fell prey to Nero's rounding up of Rome's Christians. After being held in the Mamertine prison, previously known as the Tullianum dungeon, a notorious place of, quote, neglect, darkness, and stench, end quote, according to the Roman historian Sallust, Paul was duly convicted and sentenced to death. As a Roman citizen, Paul was afforded the mercy of beheading by the sword, as opposed to the fate his fellow apostle Peter embraced, that of crucifixion. Preti sets the scene for us with almost cinematic-like monumentality and kinetic energy, as anachronistic as the expression may be. It is as if the artist has seated us in a viewing gallery so as to not miss even the slightest twitch of muscle, texture of flesh, or fleeting glance. The three principal actors are arranged horizontally in dynamic poses parallel to the picture plane. To our left, an armored Roman soldier firmly grips his pike as the plumes of his helmet gently sway in the breeze. On his left hip is visible the hilt of his sword, fashioned into the shape of an eagle's head, the preeminent symbol of Roman might and empire. And lest we should lose interest, he glances out at us to ensure our attention is duly reciprocated. Panning across the pallid flesh of our elderly saint, we come to our second Roman soldier to the right, yet of lower rank and stature. This gentleman is our executioner of the day. Muscles taut and torso in flexion, he peers down at his sanctioned victim, reaching to pull the sword from its scabbard, also surmounted by the Roman eagle should there be any doubt who has authorized the occasion. We are as if frozen in time, moments before the zenith of the action to unfold. A corpulent golden statue of Nero in the guise of Hercules towers above the scene, pressing and making present his rights to oversee this lowly Christian's demise. Paul, at the bottom of the canvas, serves as the composition's vector. His aged flesh radiates with a silverish green pallor, demarking his advanced years of ascetical struggle in the faith that he helped to establish far and wide. With hands bound behind his back, denuded to the waist, and enrobed in white and deep crimson, the divine light of grace illuminates the apostle's face, the same light that toppled him from his horse on the road to Damascus so many years before. The apostle fixates on the open scriptures before him, as a preternatural gust of wind gently stirs to turn the page. We have been denied access to Paul's fiery eyes. The deep shadow of his brow beckons us to contemplate the surety of his hope. Preti bids us to bear witness to St. Paul as he enters into his agonia, the Greek term used aplenty in the gospel and Paul's own epistles that bespeaks the great struggle for victory. Paul is near the finish line, bringing to completion his impassioned words penned to Timothy, quote, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith," end quote. It is not only Paul's faith that shines forth from the canvas, but also Preti's artistic genius to transfigure the bound and elderly figure of Paul, defeated by the world, into a visible testament to the glory of the faith. Preti understands Paul, and apparently the gospel as well. For just as the gospel inverts worldly expectation into that which is valued in the kingdom of heaven, so this image works the miracle of convincing us that despite all the trappings of a conquered and prostrate victim, we nonetheless perceive Paul as manifesting a supreme power, a supreme position of power and strength, all mediated by his faith that holds steadfast to the end before our very eyes. In fact, we are led to believe that this prone position is not unfamiliar to Paul, if not for the occasion of execution, at least for his posture during prayer. Only a great artist could so convincingly convey the depths of the Christian mysterium tremendum. We are left with a final question, and my thoughts by necessity will remain brief due to the delimitations of time and the incomplete state of my research. Namely, how might the devastating plague of 1656 have informed Preti's Martyrdom trilogy? From the outset of this presentation and ensconced in the very title is the specter that perhaps the devastating plague in Naples of 1656 might somehow inform Preti's Martyrdom trilogy at large, including the martyrdom of St. Paul. It is a leading question, which at present I can provide no definitive answer. It is clear that well prior to Preti's arrival to Naples, the artistic subject of martyrdom was already established to great effect, especially by Ribera. The predilection for these pictures certainly predates Preti's foray into the subject and falls squarely within the counter-reformational mandate to inspire the faithful by spectacular, emotionally gripping images of the saints as a measure to shore up the Roman Catholic faithful in light of the Protestant Reformation inaugurated by Martin Luther more than a century before. Therefore, the question is not whether the plague instigated the popularity of this subject. Rather, the question might be how the plague shone a new, more pressing light on the subject of martyrdom regarding how Christians should face death boldly when confronted with natural disaster. Therefore, the plague is not causal to the question, but reflexive. The pallid silverish tone of flesh in Neapolitan Baroque painting has been a long-standing preoccupation of mine. What accounts for this phenomenon rather pronounced in the art of Partenope, and how might its evolution interface with the lived experience of plague? We see this silverish pallid flesh at least as early as Caravaggio in his Martyrdom of Saint Ursula of 1610, executed in Naples but quickly spirited away to Genoa in the same year. Ursula, who has just received an arrow to her breast at point-blank range, places her hands near the wound as her life spills forth from her. Her silverish tone is no doubt a visual manifestation of impending death. Caravaggio inspired and set the trajectory for Neapolitan painting well into the 18th century. Battistello, perhaps the earliest follower of Caravaggio in Naples, also answers the call, noting the pallid tone of the supine man at the bottom of the canvas, who has just been resurrected from death. The examples are so copious as to stream forth like myrrh, but rest assured, Giovanni Lanfranco, Ribera, Stanzione, Giordano, Solimena all follow suit at one point or another. In 1656, Naples was one of the largest cities in Europe, numbering nearly 500,000 souls. By August, that number had been cut in half. Carlo Celano, in his Guide to Naples, published in 1692, reflects on what he saw in the streets in 1656 as the plague worsened from the early months of the year into the dog days of summer. Quote, "Then in the most unlucky year, 1656, our poor city, fooled by its own confidence, was assassinated by a most fierce plague. There was no more room to bury, nor anyone who could bury the dead. With my own eyes, I saw this Strada di Toledo, or Via Toledo, where I lived, paved with corpses, so that carriages going to the Palazzo Reale could not proceed except over baptized flesh. I cannot describe this tragedy further because I could not do so without tears." And thanks to Jim Clifton for this translation. And what color was that baptized flesh strewn about Via Toledo? We can have some idea as exemplified by Preti's own hand. As Jim Clifton notes, on June 12, 1656, the Deputate della Salute made several public vows to defend the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin and to pray for her aid in subduing the plague. On June 16, the Eletti of Naples decided to commission a series of 7 ex voto frescoes on each of the city gates, whereupon the commission was awarded to Preti on November 27, 1656, only days before the plague was officially announced to have receded. Although all but one of the frescoes have since been destroyed, we have 2 bozzetti that give us some insight into what the frescoes looked like. Taking but one example, Preti's bozzetto of the votive fresco for the plague of 1656 depicts the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception with child astride the crescent moon. She is flanked by the plague saints San Gennaro, Saint Francis Xavier, and Saint Rosalia. A winged angel below the Virgin floats with a sword and whip, ready to enact cessation of the plague at her command. At the lowermost register, perished corpses with their tinted flesh are strewn about. Note the tonal distinction of flesh between the muscled men seeking to remove the bodies and that of the deceased. And here I'm talking about, for instance, the contrast between these two figures. The martyrdom of St. Paul was executed not in distant proximity to the Bozzetto. His pallid flesh too, that is Paul, strikes a contrast to that of his executioner. Perhaps Ferdinand van den Eyden and any of the faithful who gazed upon the image of Paul in the throes of agonia might have taken solace in identifying the triumph of the apostle with the perishing souls in their pallid flesh on Via Toledo. Catharsis is thus exchanged between subject and object, granting both identification and hope with the heroes of the faith. Or perhaps the seductive powers of alliteration, Partenope, plague, Preti, proved too much for this author to resist. In any event, there can be no conjecture about the greatness of Mattia's painting, a moving image of strength manifest through weakness, which as yet still echoes to us through the ages. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, James, for a really marvelous and rich talk. I wonder, in fact, if we might keep up the image, keep your slides up, because I think there's so much to talk about in the Houston canvas. And I invite everyone else to turn on their cameras and microphones if they wish, so we can join each other in conversation. If you have a question, just give me a little, you can click your digital raise hand, or you can give me a wave or throw me a chat in the chat box. There's so much to talk about. I wonder if we could start by James giving just a little background on how the trilogy, as you call it, how the trio of Martyrdom pictures reached Birmingham, Rome, and Naples.
Yes, that's a great question. Let me scroll back to those images. Ferdinand van den Eyden, who commissioned the trilogy, dies in 1674, the same year, in fact, as Gaspar Römer, his friend and his father's longtime partner. Römer also died in 74. Römer bequeathed about 70 paintings to Ferdinand. What happened was, upon the death of Ferdinand in 1674, Ferdinand had 3 daughters, and the inheritance, including the art collection, was split up amongst the 3. They retained those paintings for a very long time, but eventually, I believe it's in the 19th century, well, earlier than that, but for these pictures, the collection was broken up and the paintings were lost, at least for the most part, to the art historian's eye. Francis Haskell, in I believe 1963 book, what is it, Painting and Patrons, or Patrons and Paintings, drew attention in his précis on Naples of the importance of Römer and the Van den Eydens, and cited, which were of course already noted in the inventories of the Van den Eyden family in Naples, noted the trilogy series. It was after his publication of this book that art historians began to look around and think, well, which paintings are these? By this 1970s, it had more or less been established that these paintings indeed were, there's copies of them, but these are the autographs, and they were then sold on the market. And so it's, it was the market, in a sense, that they were able to resurface, and that's how they were broken up. I hope that goes some distance to answering your question.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Any questions? Anyone want to start off? Diana, hi.
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 Thank you so much for this talk. It was I really appreciated how you opened. I feel like that allowed me to relax into actually looking deeply at the painting. And it was just very enjoyable. And my question, so while you were speaking, I took the opportunity to open the painting on Google Art Culture and really zoom in. And one of the things that struck me is the kind of latency of the violence, or the impending violence in the painting. And I think you really highlighted that well when you were talking about the way that it seems as if St. Paul is almost inhabiting the same position that he would be if he were praying, which is like the opposite of kind of, the violence that is about to happen. Like in the shadows, you start to see that sword coming out of the hilt, or just the way that that's sort of a second layer. It's not the primary thing that you notice when you first look at the scene. And then as I was zooming in, I saw the figure under St. Paul,
Yes.
the black figure. And I couldn't see this in the slide, but zooming in, I think the figure has this kind of surprised, like open-mouthed expression, which is sort of the only figure in the painting who is reacting to the violence of the scene.
Mhm.
And I was just wondering about that figure, and I don't have a specific question other than noticing these things and wondering if you had more insight or thoughts about the role of that figure in the painting more broadly.
Those are great insights. I think, I hope that part of my talk facilitated some of your, arriving at some of those positions. First, I'll start with the latent violence. This is the layer that needs to be peeled back for this painting. Often with, Baroque art, there's pop, flash bang, pyrotechnics, given the technique, given the drama of the figural arrangement, the dramatic lighting, etc. And I think here, it might not be true that Preti in every single work, is a genius, if you will. I do think, though, for this canvas, that what we have stumbled upon as viewers is a deeply sensitive treatment springing from Preti's understanding of Paul and where his strength resides. No doubt, this is a novel depiction of a martyrdom of St. Paul. I mean, typically, Paul in relation to martyrdom is holding a sword, for instance. I mean, if you go to the patriarchal church in Rome, his church, where the prison is, where his chains are, there's a 19th century sculpture out in the cortile outside with St. Paul holding a sword. So it's somewhat novel to present Paul in this manner. What is he doing but peering down at the scripture below him? Could be, the Christian Old Testament, right? Which anytime the gospel refers to the scriptures, it's referring to the Hebrew texts, or it could be his own epistles, which that would make less sense. But for us as viewers, it evokes both, right? Paul contributed more than any other author to the Christian New Testament. And so, at first glance, there's so much energy, there's so much movement and motion, and the specter of violence of this gentleman pulling his sword from the sheath, getting ready to decapitate Paul, is really just an entree into something much more meditative. And I don't think, poetic images in the Baroque don't always, sometimes that's an oxymoron, but I really think that Preti has put his finger on something here. And that's why I think that he has worked something of a visual miracle to convince us, even though every kind of formal aspect of the picture depicts Paul as being in a prone, defeated position of a victim. It's how the figure is lit. It's how he's bent over, kind of the what would you say, the virtue of his posture, the surety of his glance at the scriptures. The fact that we can't see his eyes, I think, is critical. It leaves us to ponder and to look as to what's the emotional state of the figure of St. Paul. All of that together, again, I'm just really reiterating what you said, I think make this a remarkable picture. There's more to it than what meets the eye at first glance. You're correct in pointing out that the African figure just behind the scriptures, he also has pearl earrings on, which is a splendid detail. Of course, in European art, certainly Italian art, we can think back to Gentile da Fabriano, for instance, incorporated, all kinds of quote unquote exotic figures from around the world. Naples, of course, was a port city. They had trade with countries all across the Mediterranean, into the Far East, to Africa, etc. And so, I haven't read more into that figure than just simply giving a broad spectrum of lookers on being present in the scene, and perhaps a holdover from more historic iconographies of using quote unquote exotic figures. It is interesting though, and it would be worth considering further, the fact that this figure, presumably a servant, this is typically the role that an African figure plays in these images, except for sometimes the adoration of the Magi. Sometimes African figures have more prominent, even central role to play in that regard. But it is interesting that out of all the figures in the canvas, that figure is the only one that seems to grasp the particularity of what's happening. If you look to the executioner who's drawing his sword, to our right, his left of that, you also have a turbaned man who his gaze is somewhat indeterminate. It's difficult to see even in person. But one final thought is, Preti has very cleverly doubled or paralleled the posture of St. Paul with that of Nero above, the golden statue of Nero, his downward glance, kind of the tilting, torso. And this also adds a layer to the painting. I would, it's somewhat conjecture, but I don't think it's too far afield to say that what Preti has established here and achieved is the distinction between earthly power, earthly glory and might, and that kind of power, glory, and might which is valued in the kingdom of heaven, which is exemplified by Paul. So you have, the earthly kingdom, the empire, and the heavenly kingdom, which Paul represents. So that's also, a very nice compositional adage. But certainly, these figures, although they're, somewhat more difficult to read visually, they're fantastic. And I would say on that point too, the color play, the bravo technique, especially of the flesh of St. Paul when viewed in person, is stunning. The range of colors he uses to depict the flesh of Paul is remarkable, from gray to green to red. It's very energetic when you look at it, especially the brow and the nose, and it's absolutely gripping. Yeah, thank you for those thoughts and that question.
James, we've got a couple hands raised, but I wanted to follow up on a couple of things that both you and Diana said. First, Pat Simons has a wonderful recent lecture. I can't remember. It was in Zoom land that I attended it. It was within the past year. I can't remember which institution was hosting it, but it was a new and really useful reading of the Black figure in Titian's Diana and Actaeon. And that I can search for it and send it to you. But it was a really useful way to think about how that figure functions in Titian's canvas, and maybe would help think about the Black figure here. The second thing, going back to this idea of the latency that Diana so beautifully noted, Paul isn't. Nothing seems to be touching Paul, and Paul doesn't seem to be touching anything. I mean, he's both part of this scene and not part of this scene. And this other really radical kind of compositional choice that Preti has made is, thinking about the way, for example, Caravaggio's Martyrdom of Peter, the composition is structured by that cross, that cross seen, the diagonals of the cross seen in perspective. Whereas here, where we would see, where otherwise we would have a cross structuring the composition, we have that void. I mean, we have this kind of diagonal void formed by the forearms of Paul and his executioner. So it isolates him even more, but in a way that refers to those tricks that Caravaggio is and Ribera too were always playing with.
Please. I was just wanted to say that's an excellent point. I didn't you said that better than I would have. But, part of what I'm referring to in the talk is, Paul at the bottom of the canvas serves as the composition's vector.
Yeah.
The two figures lead to him, and because he's more in the foreground and more brilliantly lit, it is an extremely clever compositional arrangement. And I think you must be right that the principle of this diagonal established, for instance, by Caravaggio's crucifixion of St. Peter is kind of transmuted through the coupling of the two figures. His executioner and Paul himself create the same diagonal effect, which is of course very Baroque.
Yeah, yeah. We have a question from James Clifton and then from Caroline.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, James. I have a question about the point of view in this picture and the other two pictures that go along with it. Preti often chose a fairly low point of view, but certainly not always, and it's self-evidently why in certain things like the frescoes over the city gates, because they were quite high. And also I think particularly for this picture, or all three pictures, you might look at the ceiling paintings, canvases set in the ceiling of San Pietro a Maiella, which were done at about the same time. Well, I guess everything in Naples is done about the same time by Mattia Preti, but in particular the beheading of Saint Catherine, which actually takes a point of view which is not so different from this, even though it was a ceiling painting. And if I remember correctly, there are inventories of the Van den Einden collection as well as Gaspar Romer's collection, but I wonder if there's any indication of where these pictures were in the palace and how they might have been hung. The other thing that's unusual about this, and I think is also comparable to the San Pietro Maiella canvases, is its roughly square shape, which is also unusual.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Your point of the matter of perspective is one of the first things upon really gazing at this painting, in Naples when it was on exhibition at the Palazzo Zavalos. Lucky enough there, not only was the Houston canvas there, but the canvas of Saint John rebuking Herod, I don't have an image of it, also presents Saint John in a strange kind of raking angle. You can also take Capodimonte's picture, which is normally in storage, of Christ striking down Satan. What all of these pictures, and there's more examples, you've mentioned many other examples, but certainly for the canvases, it seems to me that here we see Paul, the figure of Paul, taking it as a reference point because we can see it. It's here on the PowerPoint. Paul is as such leaning back, right? And it's as if his figure, in a sense, occupies two planes. There's definitely overlap between those planes, but the torso itself, in some ways, presents as kind of a vertical. But then his head glance, as his head leans back away from the shoulder, but simultaneously down. I think this technique of pushing the head back, which we see in the other two canvases I cited, is a means to monumentalize, if you will, the primary figure. It is as if, even though we're looking straight on, it's as if angle-wise we're looking at them at a raking angle. It's an odd but very striking compositional decision, and you do see that throughout several of his canvases. So I think you're right. I mean, it begs the question in terms of viewing context, where would this picture, for instance, the trilogy itself, or any others like it, where would these specifically have been displayed in the palace? I haven't, as of yet, come across material that describes where the objects were in the palazzo, but I haven't looked that hard yet, so that very well could exist. But thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Caroline, hi.
Hi, James, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I felt like you did such a wonderful job of bringing us into Van Eyden's world. Um, I was wondering a little bit, if you could speak a little bit more maybe about Preti's peregrinations across Italy, because my first thought when I saw this painting was to think about Alessandro Algardi's sculpture of the same subject in the Basilica of San Paolo Maggiore in Bologna, thinking about the very dramatic lowered viewpoint thanks to that fabulous baldacchino, but even the way the light seems to refract off of the surface of their skin. And I haven't seen the work in person, unfortunately, but even just zooming in closely, seeing the way that Preti has layered that white on top did make my mind instantly go to sculpture.
Yeah.
And given that he went to Modena, I just wondered, do we know about his time in Bologna and his engagement with sculpture?
Admittedly, to that specific question about what Preti was up to, as he's traversing between, let's say, Rome and Venice or Rome and Modena, what he might have been up to in Bologna, I can't answer that question in any specificity. So I'm sorry about that. But you bring up a broader, interesting point, and I've actually had this conversation this week, I think, with my friend and colleague Chris Bacchi. I don't know if he's on the call, but we worked together at Capodimonte. One of the things about Preti that is intriguing and makes him interesting as an artist is the traveling that he did. He traveled quite a bit. He was born in Taverna, moves to Rome, schooled in Rome, goes to Venice in the 1640s, comes back after a year. So he's definitely soaking in Titian and Veronese for sure. You can see Veronese to some degree in this picture, right? I mean, just the expansive scene set within kind of open architectural spaces with the cityscape behind it. He's definitely absorbing the artists that he encounters where he travels. He certainly stopped through Bologna, particularly when he went to Modena, and he painted a ceiling in Modena as well. So he's an artist who's quite effective, both for easel pictures as well as fresco and canvases to be seen on a ceiling. So he's quite dynamic in that sense. And what's interesting to me again is to see how he absorbs the lessons learned from the artists that he studied throughout Italy. Of course, when he comes to Naples, and that surely would have included his encounters with sculpture, to your point. But when he comes to Naples, Naples was different than Rome, where he had spent most of his time, in that the impact and ripple effect of Caravaggio in Naples remained very strong and powerful for a very long time. Unlike Rome, they kind of moved on. No one liked Caravaggio in Rome to boot. So in Naples, when Preti comes to Naples, he's stepping into first, second generation of artists in the quote unquote Neapolitan school that was founded by Caravaggio in his two brief sojourns to Naples. And so the inflection point from that point forward, he obviously saw Caravaggio in Rome, right? And during his training and was greatly inspired by it. But you can see via Ribera, for instance, I brought up the example of the Martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew and other Botticello, other artists, local artists working there, that Preti absorbs Naples. I think Preti was made for Naples. He understood the drama of Caravaggio in a way like many of his Neapolitan colleagues did, which was unique. And that's one of the reasons I think why it persisted so long into the city. Of course, we didn't talk, in 1660, he moves to Malta, where he lived for the last 40 years of his life. He was born in 1613 and died in 1699. He had a long life. So like other great artists, Michelangelo, Titian, for instance, who lived a very long time, so did Preti. And Preti basically painted the island of Malta you know. So in Caravaggio, as you know, worked and painted there as well. So he kept lapping up Caravaggio while he was there. We didn't touch on any of the later stuff, but you're right. I'm kind of playing off of your point that Preti traveled, and that's important, and you can see it in his work. So he would definitely be an artist, I would say, to your suggestion, that one should take seriously the possibility of how what he saw in the cities that he went to affected his art, because he clearly is an artist that responds to the environment, the city, the school where he's working. So that, you know, to your point, it's a great point and something that should be looked into. Thank you.
Great. We have a question from Vincent. You're on mute. Let's see.
Am
There-
am I on now?
You are.
Okay, James, really a wonderful hour. I loved it. And I'm dying to get back to Naples, but now I want to get to Houston too. I want to look at this painting. Two kind of not particularly related cities, Houston and except both port. Is that right?
That's right.
So just wonderful, James. I loved it. And, you know, even for a popolare listener like me, I found it totally captivating. Didn't feel like it was over my head. I loved it. And non cambiare. Keep doing what you're doing.
Grazie, Vincenzo.
Ciao. Thank you, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you, Vincent, for being here. I have one more question, unless anyone else wants to chime in. I wanted to ask about the dimensions. So the Houston picture is all but perfectly square. What are the dimensions of the other canvases, and do we know if and how any of them have been cut down?
Great question.
And
So
not to put you on the spot with
No.
numbers.
Well, I'm looking at one of them. The dimensions are the dimensions. Excuse me. Let me go ahead and try to scroll back to the trilogy just so we can look
Right.
at. The dimensions are basically the same between the three.
Yeah.
I converted the St. Paul to inches, you know, for our American purposes, but we can see here, for instance, the crucifixion of St. Peter is 194 by 194 centimeters.
Uh-huh.
So that's about right.
Mhm.
They were commissioned as a trilogy. There has been a suggestion in the most recent exhibition, this exhibition where I saw our painting in question for the first time, Rubens, Van Dyck, Ribera. There was a suggestion by one of the authors that in fact Gaspar Romer may have commissioned the trilogy, because within his inventory there are paintings that meet the same description. You know, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I don't think it's, at least to the depths that I've looked at it so far, critical who commissioned it between the two, because they were very intimately connected.
Yeah.
And Ferdinand certainly followed the lead of Gaspar in that sense. My point being, though, is that it is a trilogy. We know that. Giordano in the 1680s made an inventory of the Van den Eyden collection, and he notes all three paintings, and he values them at 200 ducats each. Which is a phenomenal sum. That's a massive sum, 200 each, so 600 total for the trilogy. So clearly, you know, his evaluation of these works, he thought they were great. You know, and it's Giordano, when Preti leaves in 1660, it's Giordano who becomes the prominent player in Naples until his pupil Solimena eventually takes the helm.
And it's interesting to think about too, why the square format, and this goes back to James Clifton's question of how they might have been displayed. Have they been shown together since the 70s, since they were kind of brought back to our art historical awareness?
Not to my knowledge. Jim Jim's really the Preti scholar here. He might know. I don't think they've ever been shown together, which is an intriguing proposition.
Absolutely.
I don't remember. I haven't seen them together, so they might have been. There's kind of a Preti industry or machine out there that is sort of constantly doing exhibitions of one sort or another, and so it could be that they have, but I don't recall.
Well, if they haven't, oh, Diana, yes.
I just had a small technical question about the Houston painting, about your painting. Just seeing the three like this, I noticed that the other two have these kind of cartouches or scrolls. And I was wondering if, I mean, it seems like there's a place for one, but I'm wondering if you've done any technical analysis or if there was one on the top right or elsewhere in your painting.
Very, very great question. So you're referring to,
the paper.
Yes, right. Well, the first thing would be that the inspiration for that cartouche or that paper is Christ's cross itself, called the Titulus, which said on it, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, or Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That's how Christ is always depicted on the cross, right? So you have that board on the top that identifies mocking him as being the King of the Jews. So the reason I say that is because both Bartholomew, particularly Peter, of course, he's being crucified upside down, but also Bartholomew here being strapped to the tree behind him, I think to my mind, to my eye, is evoking, right, Christ's own crucifixion. Therefore, the cartouche has a certain iconographic context in relationship to typical crucifixion scenes. The cartouche for Bartholomew says in Latin, Bartholomew Christian. For St. Peter, I don't know what it says because the quality of the image is so poor that I can't make it out. I think with St. Paul, given that the compositional decisions that Preti has made and how he's presented Paul, a cartouche would make less sense. To me, it makes sense for Bartholomew and Peter because they're lashed, to a tree, and that's evocative of the cross itself, and therefore the saints' participation in the passion of Christ. But John Spike, who wrote the catalog raisonné on Preti, seems to think that the Paul canvas is the third in the trilogy, and the quality of the photos of Bartholomew and Peter are so poor that we can't really appreciate Preti's color play in those paintings. But it does, I see more of a similarity in format between the Peter and the Bartholomew. Just the perspective, the kind of where the horizon line is, the figures occupying the lower portion, of the composition, etc. The Paul canvas looks like a break to me, which would make sense that if it was last, it's kind of evolved a little bit. So that might also be a reason why there's no cartouche. But I've looked through our object file on the Paul painting, and I see no documentation, for instance, of overpainting. So to my knowledge, there's not a little piece of paper lurking, under a few layers of paint, for instance, in the top right corner. But it's an interesting question that you ask, and I think it actually beckons us to do a kind of comparative analysis across all three canvases. Thank you.
This might be a stretch, but I wonder if also just the presence of the book as a page kind of obviates the need for that.
Yes, I think that's heading in the right direction. Both Peter and Bartholomew is relatively tranquil, but when you look at his right arm, his flesh is hanging down because it's already been started. He's already, his flaying process has already begun. The Bartholomew and the Peter canvases, to my eye, are more in line with something like what Ribera would do, talking about brutality, naturalism, the realism of, the brutal act. As we've already surmised, Preti's approach to Paul is different, and to identify the scriptures as being critical in that change of direction, I think is absolutely the right direction to go. I said it before, and it might not be the right word, but there's more poetry to the Paul. There's a little bit more there to read. There's a few more layers, perhaps, in his meditation on the figure of Paul and how to represent him in a way that at once demarks him as a martyr, as a victim, but also presents him in such a convincingly, powerful, honorable way. I mean, virtus, the Latin word for strength or honor. I mean, more than any of the three figures, I think it's Paul who best exemplifies that. And that's a great kind of visual paradox that Preti could pull that off. But I think he does it, and I think he does it successfully. Yeah.
Great. We have a question from Francesca.
Yes, thank you, James, for this wonderful lecture. And my question is more connected with the plague. The plague was an extraordinary event, of course, and it had a long effect on the visual memory, like you read in your quotation. And the artists, of course, they have a visual memory. And we say always that the representation of the real plague in the Bozzetti was probably inspired by the plague in Naples. But my question is if in the later paintings of Preti, there is other evidence of this memory, this experience. He was a survivor, and he was chosen for this great task.
Yes.
He probably reflects a lot on this experience.
There's no doubt, and you've opened the door to another hour conversation. It was a great pity. What I'm most interested in, what really sparked thank you for taking us there. My first interest in this picture when I saw it in Naples was the color of Paul's flesh. In person, when you look at it, this isn't normal. It's grayish, it's greenish, like what's happening here? The fulcrum of my intellectual interest in the picture, and if I was ever, let's say, to publish something, would go in the exact direction that you're suggesting. The broader question, before we address Preti and what he does after Naples, after being in Naples a few years and going to the museums and the churches, you see that the tonality of Neapolitan flesh in painting is often grayish. I mean, the Preti's Saint, you can see the face of Christ here. I mean, we again, it's ad nauseum. The figures here, 1653, Saint Nicholas of Bari, etc. That skin tone interests me. That's why I brought up Caravaggio's Martyrdom of Saint Ursula. I don't know if it's source zero, if you will, for that trend in Naples, but certainly Caravaggio was source zero for the Neapolitan school that built up after him. We can say that tonality of flesh pre-existed the plague, right? Because you have Caravaggio in 1610 painting the Ursula, and she's like slate gray, But the interest, and this is to your insightful question, my interest would be, how does the experience of plague somehow mediate or inflect a tradition that already existed, given the skin tone, post-plague? Did it take on different dimensions or new meanings, new implications, by virtue of artists who themselves lived through it in the city, seeing the corpses in the city? I can't help but think that there had to be some connection that was made for the artists in what they were seeing in the streets, in what the kind of flesh tone legacy was prior to that, and how that, how they chose to to use that in their work moving forward. I tend, again, it's a leading question. I didn't spend much time on the plague because it would be complicated to work this out because it pre-exists the plague. But I can't, in any universe, imagine, for instance, the St. Paul, who was probably painted in 1656 during the plague. We have the Madonna di Costantinopoli at Capodimonte. Also, I didn't show you a picture. It's an altarpiece for the Constantinople church. They're executed in 1656 with the plague saints, Saint Roch, Gennaro, Rosalia, etc. They all have this skin tone. So the lens or portal that I would use to explore your question would be, the starting point would be these works during the time of plague. How did it impact or influence artists in kind of mediating or interpreting the tonality that they had inherited since Caravaggio? And then how did they implement these tones to illustrate things that might refer to death, the plague, etc.? So that would be my starting point. But even when you go, for instance, Preti in Malta, at the great cathedral of St. John in Valletta, you have the execution of the beheading of St. John the Baptist there, which is immensely brutal by Caravaggio, famously signing his name in the blood spilling out of St. John's neck. And that body too, the body of St. John, is also this grayish tone. So to me, the tone and death have an intimate relationship. And it would be interesting to explore your question through that proposition. The tonality of the flesh and death, what's the connection there, and how do artists kind of work through that in light of the reality of the plague and what they're seeing out on the streets? That's actually my real research interest in the painting.
Well, you might also approach it from the reception end too. Whether a writer like Celano, for example, who's certainly commenting on the plague, is also allowing us to understand how these pictures might have been seen and understood in that context.
Mm-hmm.
I see a question from Gretchen.
Sorry.
Hi, Gretchen.
Hi. I have one is really just a comment and then a quick question. When you see the three together, you realize that the violence has already begun in the first two. Mm-hmm. But when you get to the St. Paul, it's the anticipation of violence. And to me, there's a real difference there. We often think the anticipation of some event is not worse than, but nearly worse than the actual event. So I don't know, does that suggest that maybe that was the final one, the third one? And then the other comment I had, just when you were talking about skin tone, I noticed that St. Peter's legs and his torso are two completely different colors. His legs look black and blue and very different. So I wonder, is that intentional, do you think? Or what does that suggest to you, if anything?
Yeah, I like the direction your mind's heading here. I obviously would like to see, I've seen Preti's Bartholomew, Palazzo Corsini, although I don't have granular memories of it. I haven't seen the St. Peter. So, what an occasion to bring the three together, right, to Houston. There's no doubt that the Bartholomew and Peter canvases need conservation. Yeah. The Houston canvas is in pristine state, optimal viewing conditions. But you're right. I mean, looking at St. Peter's legs, it's as if, the blood has run out of them because he's upside down, and the lower portion of his torso and his face are bathed in a light that the legs aren't. I mean, even the notion that he would be thinking about such things is interesting. I want to say this too, to your point and Sarah's last reflection. I very much believe that if you could choose between written documentation by an onlooker, art critic, chronicler, whoever you might be that has a textual document versus an artist and how an artist interprets another artist by virtue of how they make their own work in response to other artists. I'm playing off of Leo Steinberg here and his incredible book, Leonardo's Incessant Last Supper. It's about Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper fresco. One thing that he demonstrates to great effect in this book is how other artists interpreted the Last Supper. And he's able to discern this by the things they added and left out to Da Vinci's composition. My point here being saying, I think that artists are the greatest interpreters of images, not art historians even or chroniclers. It's great artists looking at other great artists and responding to them. That they're the ones that give us the real insight into what their counterparts had achieved. And so, yeah, absolutely. Regarding the skin tone and any direction you would take, analyzing the trilogy or broader Neapolitan art, what happens after Caravaggio, all of that, I'd be most interested in doing it through analyzing other artworks by other artists and trying to glean how they responded to one another and how they used those things. Maybe a fool's errand, but it's an interesting one nonetheless.
I think it's absolutely a question worth pursuing. Thank you. If there are no other questions, James, thank you again. This has been so rich. And I agree with what Diana said, that it was really an opportunity to kind of settle into this picture together. And I can only hope that we can all be together with it, whether in Houston or in Naples, perhaps with the other two sometime in the future. Thank you again, and to all of you for a great conversation. And leading or continuing with this theme of great Neapolitan pictures that are now far from Naples, our next research seminar is in 2 weeks on Friday, April 9th. This is a new addition to our schedule at 10 a.m. Dallas, 5 p.m. in Naples, and we'll welcome Dr. Amy Auroch and Dr. Annalise Hohn, who will join us from Compton Verney Art Gallery and Park, which holds an important collection of Neapolitan Baroque painting and decorative arts. It's a collection that's ripe for new research, and Amy and Annalise will offer us an introduction to the collection and its history and some of its highlights. So thank you again, James, and see you all again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.